Welcome to the Social Change Diaries, the show that looks behind the curtain at everything you want to know about the social justice and nonprofit landscape. I'm your host, Vanessa Wakeman. Today I'm speaking with professor, author, social commentator, and friend in my head, Melissa Harris Perry. Melissa is the Maya Angelou Presidential Chair at Wake Forest University. There she is the founding director of the Anna Julia Cooper Center and the faculty director of the Pro Humanitate Institute. She is also the co-host of Freedom on Tap. Melissa hosted the television show Melissa Harris Perry from 2012 through 2016 on weekend mornings on MSNBC. She is the author of the award-winning Barbershops, Bibles, and BET, Everyday Talk and Black Political Thought, and Sister Citizen, Shame, Stereotypes, and Black Women in America. Melissa, thank you so much for joining me today. I'm really excited to talk to you about women and thought leadership and movement building.
Wonderful. I'm really glad to have this opportunity to talk with you about those topics.
Thank you. So I've been thinking quite a bit about the role of women in movement building. I've been thinking about your thought leadership and the work you're doing with your students at the AJC Center, and just wondering, have there been any conversations about how women can contribute to movements and sort of position themselves as thought leaders, or are you seeing more of a focus on just civic engagement and people wanting to change things? I find that for women, we haven't necessarily thought strategically about how we introduce our insights in spaces so that we're taking care of ourselves while we're also taking care of communities.
Yeah, there's always, with teaching, the generational divide. And, I've been teaching at the college level for about 2 decades now. And so when I first started teaching, I was much closer in age to my students than I am now. And yet even then, and certainly now, I think there are some differences about the presumptions about women's leadership than might have been true, for example, for my mother, who was a first-generation college-educated person. I have a lot of first-gen students, but I don't think they think of women as being in the first generation of college-educated women. As my mother, for example, coming through in the late 1960s or early 1970s of graduate school, was among not only the first in her family, but the first wave of women to come through in those graduate programs altogether. And so, what I'll say is, on the one hand, my students who are who identify themselves as women, whether they're cis women or trans women, whether they're straight or queer, absolutely are very concerned about how they can interject into the public space, how they can be most impactful, how they can be, valuable to movements as well as starting their own movements. But I'm not sure that they all the time identify that there is necessarily a barrier inherent to their gender identity relative to their ability to be thought leaders. It's something that I think I probably see more. I see even the ways that it affects them. But I suspect that often it takes, your 30s and 40s to really feel, I think especially for women who live at the intersections of, racial identity and class identity, sometimes it takes a little longer to get that fully intersectional analysis. So I think what I'd say is, they absolutely are thinking of themselves as leaders, trying to think strategically about their leadership, have a very clear sense of racism and of sexism in the broadest sense, but not always of how those things will affect their ability to be taken seriously and as legitimate sort of contributors to an intellectual life.
Got it. So with that, then, are there things that you think that we can do as an older generation? And so as I look at the younger generation, I feel so hopeful about their zeal and desire and interest and, sort of unapologetic approach to wanting to be a part of something. But that's also coupled with fear and worry about how sustainable it is, because they're so eager to jump in, and, can they sustain that level of energy and commitment? What do you think we can do to sort of help prepare them, or prepare more women in general to sort of interject their insights where they can have a longer timeline, a longer impact, or sort of be committed for a longer period where they don't burn out, where they're sort of comfortable with self-care and how they can really sort of take care of themselves, while they're on these journeys?
So I have no answer to the question of how you do the work without burning out. Especially I think at this moment when people have so many people in so many different sectors who are profoundly impacted by the political and social and economic changes that seem to be happening so rapidly, and just that the kind of breathless and constant nature of the news cycle. I mean, it's hard to even just keep up with the information flow, much less the activism work. But what I will say is, I absolutely agree with you that that young people make me feel optimistic. I'm not every once in a while I feel like, get those millennials off my lawn. But for the most part, I really am quite optimistic about how they have, taken existing social movements and refined them, in ways that are surprising and exciting. I do think that our greatest responsibility always to young people, whether those young people are our students or fellow citizens or our own children, is as much as possible to try to make the world a safe place for them to make mistakes in. Because, in order for them to innovate, they have to be able to fail, and their failure can't mean the end of themselves, of their relationships, or of their movement. And so I think we have to, sometimes we're going to see some failures, for example, in the movement for Black lives, but we should not, as an older generation, take immediately to the blogs to say, how terrible and awful they are. Of course, there's some failures. There were failures in the civil rights movement. There were failures in, the movement for women's suffrage. There are, lots of failures in the attempt to abolish slavery. But you keep working, right? So we should make the world safe for them to fail in by not contributing to a discourse about young people failing. We should, I think, continue to assist, especially people living at intersectional identities, with finding the analytical tools to talk about their own experiences. It's not that people don't know that they're feeling, these experiences of oppression, but I believe a syllabus can save the world. And I really believe that I had people who helped lead me to the right authors and helped introduce me to the right folks so that I could take experiences I was having and give them names within a larger historical context. And so I think it's really important that we try to, contribute to that analysis. And then I think the last thing I'd say is, especially for women, as we're looking at both mentoring and amplifying and uplifting, the voices of emerging public intellectuals, we ought to put special emphasis on girls and women. So, what we know is that by the time they make it to high school, smart boys who are talkative and show some leadership qualities, have been asked sometimes 24 times if they'll think about running for office. But women with those same qualities, girls with those same qualities, are never asked if they've considered running for office. So, do it. Next time you see a really fabulous woman give a speech in any kind of public setting, say to her, are you thinking about running for office? Maybe you should think about running for office. Here are some resources if you're thinking about running for office. We should... if you read an article by a brilliant woman writer, use your social media to amplify that and use the word brilliant to talk about her. When you're writing letters of recommendation, make sure that we are emphasizing the skills and capacities of the students that we are, referring on to graduate school and law school, and not just saying that they're nice or that they're, they have good personalities or that they're accommodating. I think we have to be careful so that we are cultivating the things we want to see in the world.
Right. I want to go back to the point you made about failure in the movement. I think that is like such a critical point and one that deserves a moment of silence. I often think that we are so critical of those who are building movements or, participating in movements that if it's not going exactly according to plan, then we start to discount the contributions. And when I think about women, we do a lot of work at at my agency, the Wakeman Agency, around women in thought leadership. And one of the most common responses I hear from women about why they are sort of unsteady in their footing about putting their voice forward is because they feel that it has to be perfect, a fully crafted idea where they have all the answers. And when I'm talking to men, they are not concerned about having the idea fully sort of fleshed out. They're just sort of throwing in their contribution where it is, and they're willing to sort of ride the wave to see what happens. And so when I think about women being part of movements, I wonder if this idea of failure is sort of like another roadblock to someone sort of taking that leadership role. Like how, and are there things that we can do? I want to sort of chat in a minute about your concept of squad care, but I'm wondering if there are sort of support pieces that we can put in place and sort of have like a, tacit arrangement where people understand it's not about having all the answers, but it's answering the call, to civic engagement, based on what you feel fired up about, like what injustice is sort of moving you to act. And it's really painful to me when I meet brilliant women who are running nonprofit organizations that are, raising money and really creating change, but they're doing it head down. They're doing it, silent. They're doing it sort of taking a safer approach, and they have all of these ideas, but they're really nervous and afraid, and don't think that there's any value to what they have to contribute. And so I'm just thinking about, like, how do we reframe this idea of failure so that, to me and my company, we celebrate failure all the time. There's always some like, oops, but it's a good opportunity to sort of think about, okay, well, that didn't work. So, let's celebrate that we tried something different. Like, how do we take that to, the issue of poverty or, racial justice? I don't have the answer, but like, what do you feel like there's any temperament or tolerance for failure in these very public environments?
Yeah, I was going to say, look, girls and women are not, we're not responding just to some kind of internal, critique. We're responding to a world that absolutely punishes women for failure more harshly and more publicly than it punishes men. Part of the reason that men and boys are more willing to just kind of, throw it at the board and see what sticks is in part because there'll be women there to fix it. So, again, I think I talked earlier about my mom coming through as a graduate student, in the late 60s and early 70s. Well, my father came through at the same time. But, the reality is that women were, for example, often typing the dissertations of their boyfriends, husbands, brothers. And so, the men would have the big ideas, and then the women would clean it all up and make sure that it was actually a presentable document. And in certain ways, I think we've had that kind of division of labor and everything from electoral politics to social movements where, I call it, men talking and women walking, right? So men get to have these big ideas that are kind of partly formed, and then there's usually a staff, right, around them who will sort of implement them, right? And that staff may be a paid staff, or it may literally just be like the loving companions who see a big idea in a man and think, oh, we need to hold that up because that's what we're used to imagining leadership looking like. Whereas we don't always notice leadership when it is quieter, when it empowers others, when it doesn't sort of place itself out front, or even if it does all those things, but it does them in a woman's body, we're taught to see that as irritating and self-promoting, rather than as leadership. So I think that, part of it is we have to acknowledge that girls and women are responding to very real social media and employment kinds of punishments that come from being less than perfect. But I really, I think the only solution that I have encountered in terms of when I think about the women who are truly, for me, role models or mentors is that despite all of that, despite those often painful public punishments for their failures, they learn to kind of walk through them, even knowing that the world wasn't going to applaud. So knowing that there would be a ton of criticism, they kind of found a center. And I do think that you can't find that center entirely by yourself. You really do need other people who are affirming you in that, who are saying, you really are special and fabulous and great. And when you go somewhere, I'm going to follow you. And that's what's going to make you a leader. And it doesn't have to be 1 million people, but it does have to be a few people. I think if you're standing completely alone in the world and I guess there's a few people who are constitutionally that way, but I don't think that's sustainable. I think for most of us, we need some level of affirmation from folks about the core of who we are, so that even if the things we do are imperfect, we have people around us who are saying, well, that project you did was a mess, girl. That paper needs to be rewritten, but you are perfect, right? You are brilliant. You are fantastic. I believe in your skills as a thinker, a writer, a leader, an organization builder, but maybe we'll take a class on how to balance a budget. And, let's sign up here for, let's get some training on how to do this or that. But I actually fundamentally believe in you. Man, if you don't have at least a few people who are cheering you on like that, I actually don't really know how you walk through how painful the public critiques can be.
So let me ask you a question about your journey. So thinking about your time on TV with the show that we all tuned into faithfully every week, and like, what is she going to say this week? Like, you had an entire squad of people who you are our friend in our head who were like, yes, wait, did she just say? Tell me how. So I would imagine as much of sort of the cheerleaders and champions for you there were also some detractors. How did you manage that? Like, how did you find yourself right when other people were sort of finding you wrong and telling you all of the things that were wrong with what you were sharing and what they didn't like about it? Now, I know that a lot of women have shared with me that the idea of someone disagreeing with their point of view feels crippling, and it's not a risk that they want to take. So are there any sort of talisman along your journey that you grabbed onto to help you sort of strengthen yourself as you moved on? I know you talk about having this group of supporters, but are there any things that helped you to feel stronger as you moved forward with that?
Well, there actually were several strategies that I used. And the first thing I'll say is it's not as though, even with the strategies, that there weren't times that were not just painful, but excruciating in terms of the sort of public criticism. So I'll walk through it a little bit. There were basically two kinds of feedback that as much as possible I tried to protect myself from. So I never looked at the ratings of my television show. Never. Not one time, never. I have no idea what we rated. I don't even really know how to read a TV rating. There are people who host shows who read quarter hours. So literally quarter hours every 15 minutes. They will tell you how you're ranked relative to other people, as well as how many people are watching. And I have colleagues, some of whom are extremely smart and good in the business, who read their quarter hours every single day. I chose never to know what my ratings were. Now, my executive producer knew, and he certainly tried to make choices and push us in one direction or another, in part based on what he knew about the quarter hours. But it was important to me that I not have that feedback because for me, I didn't want to value that metric. I wanted my team, the nerds, and me to judge whether or not a segment was valuable or good, whether or not a topic was worth doing, not based on whether or not people were, turning off or tuning in. And, so part of it is I think we do actually have to protect ourselves from the most either spurious or negative feedback. The other thing is I didn't read the @replies on my social media for 4 years. And, it's funny because in the past year, I now read them and I'm starting to form relationships on Twitter again, like I did when I very first, joined social media. But for the 4 years that I hosted the show, when I tell you I never read an @ reply. And it's simply because as a Black woman on television, the amount of violence and, I mean, it's not just critique. Critique is one thing, but, threats against my life, threats to rape me, threats to rape my child, threats to kill my parents, often just for saying things like, good morning, it's Saturday. I mean, when I tell you that world of social media for women, especially I think women of color with a strong viewpoint, can be brutal. And I watch people like, Soledad O'Brien or Joy Reid, both folks who I just respect at the highest level, and they just do battle with the social media trolls, and they are just on there, and they're, hey, that is not me. I can't. If I see those kinds of messages, I walk around with them, and it's like they stick to me. So I think you have to know a little bit about yourself. But for me, I needed to not see the most negative and painful, and I needed to not see spurious. All right, so once I didn't have that feedback, then the question is, so what feedback are you using? Because you got to judge yourself on something. And I basically had 3 rules about the audiences I cared about. One was the nerds. There were 12 of us who made that show, and I deeply respected the people that I worked with. And I looked for their feedback about what we were doing. Did they think it landed? Did they think it was smart? Should we change this? Should we pick this up and do it again? I think having peers, not just cheerleaders, because they were cheerleaders in some important ways, but also fierce critics. But you got to have people who you respect in whatever field you're doing around you, who will tell you the truth and who you will tell the truth to, as a kind of assessment pool. The second thing was I had some rules. If a guest taught me something and kept me engaged, that was a good guest. I didn't really care if they were conservative or liberal or, what their racial background or anything was. If you came on the show in the 7 minutes that you had, you taught me something I'd never thought about. If you took some political concept and turned it on its head, if you could make me speechless, then I don't care what the quarter hours say. You're a good guest, and I want you booked again. I want to pursue our television relationship. And so that was like, a rule I had. And then the third thing is I had a few sort of imagined and somewhat real audiences. So, I had some professors, Dr. Kathy Cohen, who is this brilliant Black woman professor at the University of Chicago. And, often I was like, well, I wonder if Kathy liked it. And, there were people like my former, editor at The Nation magazine, or, there's sort of like 4 or 5 or 6 people in the world who I think of as like, I'm trying to be as smart and as good as them. And so if they would like it, if they would every once in a while drop me a note and say, man, that was great. I was like, okay, we're on the right track. Or if I get the note that said, what the hell are you doing? Then I'd say, we're not on the right track. So that was, for me, it's like you got to have peers who you respect. You have to have some internal rules for yourself about what counts as quality. And then you need some aspirational people who you're yearning for. So I didn't care about the ratings, but I cared about ratings from this handful of people in the world. And if they were with me and I was with me, then that was enough. But sure, there were still moments when it was, when all of that would break through or break down, and we'd make mistakes that hurt people and or hurt ourselves. And as the leader of that team, the buck stops with me, and I would have to take responsibility for protecting our team and our show, or our values in the end, which is what I chose to protect. And that was not always easy.
That's great advice for our listeners. Now, I have a Black woman question. So one of Zora Neale Hurston, one of her quotes that I refer to far too often is the Black woman is the mule of America. When I'm thinking about...
Oh, the whole world.
Yeah, yes. When I'm thinking about the increase in numbers of Black women and women of color who are coming to the front lines to, lead movements or, sort of right the ship, it makes me think about, are we in some way muling? So oftentimes we're doing the work that no one else wants to do. We're carrying the baggage, and trying to make everyone feel right. Or like, let me sort of, shore up over here on the left. Let me fix this. Let me sort of help, these folks. How can we lead in a way that we are not mules? And is that where self-care and squad care really becomes important, because you have these people who are sort of looking after you and making sure you're not going, so far down the rabbit hole that you just can never recover, and you just, have a lifetime of, as we call, muledom.
It's so funny you say that. My husband and I were flying back from New Orleans and reflecting on Black woman mayor in New Orleans and a Black woman mayor in Charlotte and potentially a Black woman mayor in Atlanta. And so we were just talking about these, major Southern cities with Black women mayors. My husband says to me, yeah, hell, looks like Black women just gonna fix it again. And I laughed when he said it, in part because obviously he knows my work and so some of that is him teasing me about feeling like some of my academic work is like coming to pass in the real world. But part of it is also, when things get really bad, it does feel over and over again like, oh, okay, we'll call the sisters, they'll fix it. And so that we're not inheriting at the top, right? We inherit so-called power actually when things are at their worst, right? And when you have to climb such a mountain to try to address it. So, I guess I'd say a couple things. One, the struggle continues. And so Zora Neale's point, you really can't quote her enough. She is in the middle of the Harlem Renaissance. And the truth is we totally lost Zora Neale if it wasn't for Alice Walker coming and recovering her later. We ignored her work for decades. It's not like she was one of the Harlem Renaissance writers who got to come along with the boys, right? We
That's
just
right.
remembered the boys and forgot her. It's the same thing with Anna Julia Cooper, for whom my center is named, who was a contemporary of Du Bois and of Booker T. Washington, but whose name we really don't know because she was the girl. And so, part of it is I don't presume myself to be more likely to live in a moment when that will stop being true than it was for women as brilliant as Ida Wells and Mary Church Terrell and Zora Neale Hurston. If the answer were easy, they'd have damn sure already had it. So I suspect part of it is that we will just continue to be in this struggle around trying to be full selves and meet our sense of commitment to community and to the future. And that will make it some marginally better, and then it'll get worse, and then it'll get better. But there's no one thing. What I do think is that what's crucial is that when we are in leadership, we are speaking not only for the community in some non-gendered way or primarily for Black men, but that we have to speak up for girls and women at the same time. So I'm watching this Me Too moment, and I got a lot of pain about this Me Too moment. Me Too was initially an empathetic response of a Black woman to a child about the experience of sexual assault, right? She first imagines it in that context, but what Me Too feels like now is literally white women saying, me too. And man, that feels completely different than that sense of empathy between a Black woman and a Black girl who are sharing an intergenerational moment of struggle and resilience and survival. And so I watch how many Black women are not speaking in this moment, right? So it is as though we recognize that for all of the movement that seems to be happening around some level of protection or outrage about the experiences of white women relative to sexual assault and harassment, it's like we know, and we have good reason to know, that our experiences are unlikely to be read and received in the same way, that our vulnerability is rarely ever reflected and perceived as vulnerable in the same way. We know that as much as all this Me Too language is going on, there's also kind of a nod, just us, about how the criminalization of sexual assault occurs for Black and brown girls and poor girls. So, I guess part of what I'd say is here's this moment where I see us not speaking, and I understand that we're not, because it also means there'll be a lot of Black male perpetrators who are not held accountable for their violence against girls and women. And that's tough, because I get why we're not talking, but I also get that it then keeps us from holding many of these Black men accountable, men who we don't want to see criminalized, men who we don't want to see jailed, but who we nonetheless really need to have this conversation internally. So I guess what I'd say is, like, to do it, we're going to stay and struggle. It's not going to be easy, but we've got to be able to speak for our issues at the same time that we're representing everybody else.
Right. And to me, that's how we are constantly sort of wearing our mule hat in some way all the time. So we are, do we sacrifice ourselves, or do we sort of, speak out and tell our truth, and then have, people in the community who are, removed or punished or whatever. So we're constantly having to choose between ourselves and the different groups around us. And rarely are we choosing ourselves first.
I think that's right. And it's part of why the squad matters, right? If we don't choose women, if we don't choose to believe Black women when they speak and follow them when they lead, then we can hardly complain that others don't. And so a lot of it is both, like how we lead, but also how we follow and support. So, again, the number of kind of Black women stars I know who then made, I don't mean stars like Hollywood stars, but stars in their field whose like proteges are not other Black women is crazy to me. It's part of why I love and respect Ava DuVernay so much, is that not just on like a personal one-on-one level, but structurally, she has altered the landscape for women directors. She's made it so that women, and women of color in particular, can tell their stories in a whole new way. She tied her own, shows and movies and to other Black women. That is a model we have to use, because if nobody else is going to do it for us but us. It doesn't mean every single Black woman. You don't have to. It's not identity politics. Like, we still have taste. We still care. We don't like everybody just because they have the same identity. But to the extent that we do like and care and respect, women of color, we need to be really vocal and clear about that.
So you touched a little bit on squad care. For a listener who is not familiar with that concept, can you share sort of what that is and how one sort of creates the squad for squad care?
So it's funny. This came up with a group of young women writers who I was working with in the last academic year, who were writing a big project for Elle during the time I was serving as editor at large. And, they were constantly talking about self-care, and I would just say, I don't believe in self-care. Self-care is not real. I don't believe in self-care. And so finally, one of them said to me, MHP, what in the world do you mean you don't believe in self-care? And I gave them my, sort of my deal here is, I believe in self-maintenance. I mean, eat right, exercise, get your nails done, whatever. But for me, that's not care, in the sense that when I am truly broken, when I have fallen out, when I'm either so emotionally or financially or just in whatever way personally overwhelmed, the whole point is that I can't help myself. That, I've been kind of helping myself all along, but then, you hit these walls where you actually can't help yourself, and you need somebody else to help you. And so, what I like to say is, well, yeah, I believe in self-maintenance, but when I need care, you won't have to do it for me. I need somebody else to pick me up because I've fallen down and I can't get up. And so part of it is intimate relationships, friendships, work relationships, beloveds, family members. But there's another level to squad care, and that for me is the political, which is to say, when I say that people need help because we can't just kind of self-care our way through it, I really mean everybody. Like, we don't all homeschool our children. We need high quality public schools because actually it takes a squad to make, a K through 12 education possible for every kid. We actually need, healthcare and parental leave because that's how we care for each other in a big, in a big democracy. We have to make choices that say that we value not only ourselves and what's good for us, but that we value the ability to care for each other. And, I think that's been kind of taken as like this, like liberal paternalism. And it's not about saying, I know it's better for you, so I'm giving you this, because that's not caring at all. It's about making space for other people through structural equity so that everybody can like stand in some sort of reasonably equal location. Without that, you just can't expect that people, yourself or anyone else, can self-care their way through it. I think about surviving sexual assault, and, I spent a decade from the time I was 14 until my mid-20s not telling anyone that it had happened, and, I guess trying to self-care my way through it. And let me tell you, that was an abysmal failure. It required me telling so that other people could help me get through the brush and bramble and pain of surviving, adolescent sexual assault. To ask for help is tough a lot of times for Black women, but we got to do it.
I agree. I feel like I've sort of the first chapter of my journey was very much like, oh, I'm strong. I got it. And then when I realized that the real strong women were the ones who were relying on others to support them, I was like, oh, that's a thing. Wait, that's possible. And so now my squad is on speed dial. Like they just know what's happening. I saw a meme the other day that said something about surround your people who know what you need without you having to say anything. And I was like, that's what I think is so valuable and beautiful in relationships with women. And while my squad primarily began in relationships that have nothing to do with my work, I love that they're all invested in my growth in my work. And so as I'm sort of going into new territory and things that are, scary for me or unfamiliar for me, they are holding me up and sort of, pushing me on to make sure that I'm becoming the best version of myself. And so thank you for that, because I think you've given me some more ammunition to use when I'm speaking with women and talking with sort of how they can prepare themselves for, their role in social change and how they can take on the leadership role. That's really helpful.
Yeah, it was an exciting opportunity. The students took that whole sort of narrative and then they went and wrote really beautiful pieces about squad care through some careful reporting and interviewing of folks in social movements. And it's a very nice package. You can still go to L.com and you type in squad care, it'll come up all the writing that these young women did around it. And I think over and over again, you see these stories that no matter how much it looks like you see just one person who's leading, it's never just one person. It's always the squad.
Yes, I read those and they were fantastic. And I will definitely include that link for the podcast. One of the questions that I've asked all of my guests, so this entire first season of the Social Change Diaries has been focused on women in thought leadership. And I'm curious about the idea of vulnerability. For me, vulnerability is critical to thought leadership because you're sharing new information, information that people may not be familiar with. And so I'm curious for you, Melissa, when do you feel most vulnerable in your work?
I think there's a couple of times, one, I always feel very responsible for my staff or my team. And so anytime I'm making a decision that I feel comfortable with based on my own either ethics or, my cost benefit analysis, my nervousness about whether or not my team is going to be okay when I make that decision. So, for example, I just stepped down from an administrative role at the university. I was holding two, and I stepped down from one of them. And I feel so nervous about. And my team is fine. I mean, they're fine. But I just have this sense of. And of course, one of the members of my squad says to me, girl, we grown ass women. You just got to go get your life. So, thank you. That was helpful, right? But, I want to, because I have that, that girl woman impulse, I want to protect everybody and hold everybody. And so if I make a decision and it ends up badly for my team, I just feel like I feel such an emotional failure and a professional failure. So that's one. I think the other time for me is, as much as I, will share many parts of my life, there are always some parts that we protect. And I think we should, by the way. We need some privacy. But occasionally, those are parts that for some reason or another, I need to express to either the general public or even just to, a colleague or a leader. So, for example, if I'm dealing with a budgetary issue and I have to talk about some of the, painful things that are going on in our organizational budget, or quite honestly, in my personal budget. Oh man, I hate to talk about that stuff. And I don't want to show the warts that I have carefully protected. And so I think even for those of us who are pretty publicly revealing, there's still these moments of having to be self-revealing that open you up to the possibility of rejection. And then I think the last one is, and I think this is, true for everybody. I heard you talk about doing things that are scary as you try to grow professionally. Man, I don't like to fail. I want it to be safe to fail. But, anytime I have to change course because, all right, this thing is not working anymore. And so, can I make a living writing? Can I write for a magazine? I've never done that before. Can I, teach this kind of class? Can I leave the Ivy League and go to Tulane because, I met the love of my life? That seems crazy. I already got divorced once. So here I am leaving an Ivy League tenured job to go follow a man. Oh my God. that was a story that I kept telling myself in my head. And that's not exactly what it was, but that was one way you could tell the story. And so I was terrified. And so I think anytime we think we might fail, especially if we've fallen down before, it's scary. It's vulnerable. Yeah, you're vulnerable in that moment.
Well, thank you for sharing your vulnerabilities and your truths. I have one more question for you, and then I'm going to let you go because I know for certain I could talk to you all night, even though that's not what you want. If we're thinking about what we just saw in these midterm elections and looking forward to 2020, what would you like to see in 2020 as it relates to women in public office and just women in movements and in social change in general? Like if you were sort of waving your MHP magic wand, what would you create?
It's funny. I want to see the same thing in 2020 that I always want to see in a presidential election year. And what made me so sad in 2016 that I felt like we didn't have, and that is a robust, crowded field in the primaries for the presidency. So I want everybody to run. I like it when the folks who are running, look, the Republicans agree or disagree with where they stood and where they stand. There were a lot of them that wanted to be president. So many that, remember, there were decisions about who, at what point are you allowed to be on the stage? There were so many they didn't fit on the stage, right? And again, whatever we think about the politics there, you had two Latinos who were, so Ted Cruz and Marco Rubio, who were among the top folks. You had an African-American candidate who has gone on now to be the HUD secretary. God help us all. We had Carly Fiorina, who's a woman out of business who's running. I know this is going to sound nuts, but I want the Democratic primary to be as, diverse as the Republican primary was in 2016. I want to see women and people of color and folks from, both political backgrounds and business backgrounds and organizing backgrounds. We're the Democratic Party, for God's sake. Everybody should be running, and then let the people choose. Now, ultimately it all works out or doesn't work out as one or two candidates. But I think if you don't have a robust primary with lots of voices, then you won't contest the party. You won't have challenges. You won't ask yourself, what is the soul of our party? Which, again, whatever we think about what's happening in Washington right now, Republicans are definitely testing the soul of their party and having these fights. And I think that's quite healthy. And so I want to see that on both sides. We're a big country. We're a diverse country. No one can expect that there's going to come some endpoint when we all agree and march off into the sunset. Power will always be contested. And so I want healthy parties that represent folks on both sides. And then I guess the last thing I'd say is, was it it was a red carpet moment, and one of the stars says, "I'm rooting for all the Black people." And so they were asking, like, who do you want to win the award? Because I'm rooting for all the Black people. So, I was like, yeah, okay. So I want robust parties and big primaries and all the questions of democracy. But then, I'm basically always rooting for the Black girls. And so, and I don't even agree with all the Black girls, but I'm rooting for them nonetheless because, I think, and I mean Black in the broadest sense, I mean Black and brown girls. I want to see us out there. I want to see Latinas and Black women and new immigrants and women in hijab and, because I think we get it better as a country when women are running it.
I agree with that. And sort of your vision for seeing women of color in the mix is my vision for social change. When we created our thought leadership program for women, She Roars, we created a goal of 2,020 women by the year 2020. And it's like, looking at the stats for the number of women who are in nonprofits. So about more than 70% of the workforce in nonprofits are women, but I think it's less than 20% are leading and a much smaller percentage are women of color. And so if there's anything that I hope that our work can do is really to help women to take on that thought leadership role and allow women of color to see that this is an option for them, that their, ideas and opinions and insights and experiences matter. And so thank you for your encouragement on this call and all of your knowledge and wisdom. This is a fantastic interview, and I'm just really grateful to have some time to chat with you. Is there anything else you'd like to share before I let you go?
No, I really, again, I greatly appreciate the opportunity. It's a lot of fun.
Thank you so much. We will definitely be chatting again, and I appreciate our time today.
Fantastic. Thank you.
There are two things that really stood out for me in my conversation with Melissa. The first one is the idea of failure as it relates to movement and platform building. We've been socialized to believe that there is no space for failure, and I'm sure that keeps many people from ever stepping forward. Fear of being wrong, fear of failing. When we think about it, thought leadership is about influencing people to behave and think differently. If we view failure through that lens, assuming that even if you don't achieve the desired outcomes, but you are able to get people to consider a different approach, is it then worth it to you to cast away any doubt and fear and move forward? I certainly think that's something worth considering. And the other thing I enjoyed about my conversation with Melissa, was her transparency and authenticity. She shared so much about her personal journey, and I'm appreciative of her generosity for doing that. For me, intuitively, I know that some of what she shared will be exactly what some of our listeners need to hear to move them forward toward their goals, even when the path looks different from what they imagine. So this feels like the perfect final interview for season 1. I want to give a big thank you to all of my guests for making this first season of the Social Change Diaries a huge success. It's been a wonderful opportunity to hear a number of perspectives from women about thought leadership and women. And of course, to all of our listeners, thank you for tuning in each week to hear our conversations. I appreciate your feedback and looking forward to connecting with you when we launch season 2 in January.